The Venezuela economy that nailed Maduro the verdict. The year is Arli Arlu. Nicolás Maduro is sitting in a holding cell in Brooklyn. Cold light, steel walls, no cameras, no speeches. But before history rushes to simplify this moment, before the headlines dry the ink, one thing must be made clear. It wasn't just a special forces operation that put him there. It wasn't just diplomacy. It wasn't even just politics. The handcuffs you saw in the news were not forged overnight. They were forged 10 years ago. Forged by spreadsheets. Forged by balance sheets. Forged by an economic collapse so extreme, so mathematically violent, that it transformed the wealthiest nation in South America into a crime scene. Imagine this for a moment. You are sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. More than Saudi Arabia. More than the United States. You have paradise beaches. Fertile land, a literate population. A geological lottery ticket worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And then you starve. Not metaphorically. Literally. Your economy doesn't just shrink. It deletes 80% of itself in a single decade. A cup of coffee costs $3 million. Your currency becomes cheaper than toilet paper. Doctors earn $6 a month. And people weave purses out of banknotes because the craft value is higher than the face value. This isn't a story about sanctions alone. It's not a story about ideology in isolation. This is a forensic audit. A step-by-step autopsy of how a country can win the resource lottery and still go broke. Today, we're not here to ask how Maduro was arrested. We're here to ask something far more dangerous. How did the economy nail him first? Because long before the cell, long before the indictment, long before the bounty, the verdict had already been reached. The trap was set years earlier. And like all great economic traps, it began with abundance, with a number so large it felt impossible to fail. 300 billion barrels of oil. That single statistic shaped everything that followed: the arrogance, the dependence, the denial. Economists have a name for what happens next. They call it Dutch disease. But that phrase doesn't capture the emotional truth of what happened to Venezuela. Because oil is not just a commodity. Oil is a jealous god. It rewards you generously, but only as long as you worship it alone. The moment you stop building anything else, the moment you forget how to grow food, it's the moment you stop maintaining the machines that extract it, the god turns on you. And when Nicolás Maduro took power in 2013, he didn't inherit a thriving engine. He inherited a machine already overheating and decided to floor the accelerator. This is the story of what happens when economics stops obeying reality, and reality eventually enforces the verdict. In the next section, we're going back to the exact moment the trap was laid, to the oil, the currency, and the fatal decision to stop making anything at all. Because once a nation forgets how to produce, everything else becomes a performance, and performances eventually collapse. The oil illusion. How Venezuela stopped making anything. To understand how Venezuela collapsed, you have to rewind long before Maduro, long before sanctions, long before hyperinflation. You have to go back to the moment oil stopped being a blessing and started becoming a substitute for thinking. In the mid-20th century, Venezuela was the success story of Latin America. It wasn't poor, it wasn't isolated, it wasn't chaotic. In the 1950s, Venezuela's GDP per capita rivaled parts of Europe. Caracas was modern, middle-class, confident. Migrants arrived from Spain, Italy, Portugal, not the other way around. And oil paid for everything: roads, hospitals, subsidies, imports. So much oil money flooded in that Venezuela never had to ask a difficult question. What happens if this stops? Instead of using oil revenue to build a diversified economy, Venezuela used it to replace one. Why invest in manufacturing when imports were cheap? Why grow food when dollars could buy it abroad? Why tax citizens when oil paid the bills? This is the first stage of the trap. When the state doesn't need its people to fund itself, it stops listening to them. Oil allowed Venezuelan governments long before socialism to avoid accountability. No broad tax base, no productivity pressure, no incentive to nurture private enterprise. Oil money didn't just distort prices, it distorted power. By the 1990s, the cracks were already visible. When oil prices fell, the economy wobbled. Inflation surged, debt piled up, living standards slipped. And then came the political response. Hugo Chavez didn't rise because Venezuela was poor. He rose because Venezuela was mismanaged abundance. He promised to take the oil wealth back from elites and distribute it directly to the people. And for a while, with oil prices rising, it looked like it worked. Subsidies expanded. Price controls spread. The state grew. And here's the critical mistake that set the clock ticking. Oil revenue stopped being invested. It started being spent. PDVSA, once one of the most respected oil companies in the world, was transformed from an engineering firm into a social program. Profits were diverted. Maintenance was delayed. Talent fled. Production quietly declined even as prices rose. This is the most dangerous phase of a resource economy. When high prices mask falling capacity, you feel rich, while the engine is rusting. By the time Maduro took office, Venezuela was already importing nearly everything it consumed. Food, medicine, spare parts, all paid for with oil dollars. The country no longer knew how to feed itself. And feeding yourself is the final line between sovereignty and collapse. Once you cross it, you're no longer an economy. You're a pipeline. In the next section, we're going to expose the mechanism that turned this dependence into a death sentence: the currency controls, price controls, and monetary lies that converted an oil downturn into total economic annihilation. This is where theory meets reality, and reality doesn't negotiate. The monetary crime scene: currency controls, price lies, and hyperinflation. Every economic collapse has a moment when bad policy turns fatal. For Venezuela, that moment wasn't the oil price crash. It wasn't sanctions. It wasn't even corruption, at least not by itself. It was the decision to lie about prices, and then force everyone else to pretend the lie was real. The mechanism was deceptively simple. When oil prices began to soften in the early 2010s, Venezuela faced a choice every import-dependent country eventually faces: either allow the currency to adjust, or deny reality and control it by force. Maduro chose force. In 2003, currency controls were introduced as a temporary emergency measure. By the time Maduro inherited power, they had hardened into a permanent system. The government fixed the exchange rate: one official dollar price, one legal reality. But markets don't disappear when you outlaw them. They go underground. Very quickly, Venezuela developed multiple exchange rates: an official one for political allies, a semi-official one for selected imports, and a black market rate that reflected actual scarcity. The spread between them wasn't small. It was astronomical. If you had access to official dollars, you could buy them cheaply and sell them on the black market for enormous profit. Instantly, risk-free. No factory required, no innovation needed. Just proximity to power. This is how economies rot. Its production dies because arbitrage replaces work. Why manufacture goods when importing them, or simply flipping currency, is infinitely more profitable? But the government went further. To protect the people, it imposed price controls on food, medicine, fuel, and basic goods. Milk, bread, rice, insulin. The prices were politically popular and economically lethal. Because when you cap prices below production cost, producers don't become charitable. They disappear. Factories shut down, farmers stop planting. Importers walk away. Shelves emptied. Scarcity exploded. And scarcity is where the final lie begins. Rather than admit failure, the state blamed hoarding, speculation, sabotage, foreign conspiracies. So it printed money. A lot of it. The logic was circular and fatal. Shortages gives subsidies, gives deficits, gives money printing, gives inflation, gives more shortages. By 2017, Venezuela crossed the threshold into hyperinflation. Prices doubled in weeks, then days, then hours. People were paid in the morning and rushed to spend their wages before sunset because by nightfall, the money had already lost value. This wasn't just economic pain, it was psychological destruction. Money stopped being a store of value. Contracts stopped making sense. Time itself broke. And when money breaks, law follows. Because salaries can't sustain police. Courts can't function without budgets. Hospitals can't operate when supplies vanish. This is when the economy stops disciplining power and starts exposing it. The regime survived politically, but the system beneath it collapsed completely. In the next section, we are going to connect this economic implosion to the modern world, how Venezuela became a warning, how sanctions interacted with collapse, and why the country turned into a criminalized economy long before Maduro was arrested. This is where economics turns into geopolitics, and where the verdict becomes unavoidable. Sanctions, criminalization, and the economy that turned on its own state by the time international sanctions tightened. Venezuela's economy was already dead. What sanctions did was not kill the patient. They revealed the autopsy. This distinction matters because it explains why the state itself began to mutate. When formal markets collapse, informal ones don't disappear. They replace the state. By the late 2010s, Venezuela had transitioned into something economists rarely like to name out loud: a criminalized economy. Oil production had fallen off a cliff. Tax revenue had evaporated. The currency was worthless. But power still needed money. So it found it elsewhere. Gold mining in the Orinoco region exploded, not as an industry, but as a war economy. Armed groups, military units, and political operators controlled territory, extracted gold, and smuggled it through informal networks. Drug trafficking routes shifted. Fuel smuggling flourished, selling gasoline abroad that was practically free at home. Human trafficking surged as millions fled. This is what happens when the state can no longer fund itself legally, doesn't reform. It adapts downward, and sanctions accelerated this transformation. With access to global financial systems restricted, the regime leaned even harder on opaque channels. Shell companies, frontmen, gold for cash trades, cryptocurrency experiments. The economy stopped being about growth. It became about survival at the top, and this is where the final irony emerges. Sanctions are often framed as punishment. But in Venezuela's case, the true punishment had already been delivered by economics. Hyperinflation destroyed the middle class. Price controls destroyed domestic production. Currency controls destroyed trust. Sanctions didn't cause the collapse. They locked it in place. By the early 2020s, Venezuela wasn't a socialist economy. It wasn't a capitalist economy either. It was a dual system. One economy for those connected to power, operating in dollars protected. Insulated another economy for everyone else, operating in scarcity, barter, and exit. This is how inequality becomes absolute. Not rich versus poor, but inside versus outside. And once that divide hardens, politics becomes theater. Elections don't change incentives. Speeches don't refill shelves. Promises don't rebuild trust. This is why the arrest of Nicolás Maduro shocked the world, but did not shock economists. It's because from an economic standpoint, the verdict had already been delivered. A regime that loses its productive base, loses its legitimacy, loses its currency, eventually loses protection. In the next and final section, we're going to deliver the verdict in full, not just on Maduro, but on the system that created him, and why Venezuela is not an outlier. It's a preview. The verdict. How economics always catches up. By the time Nicolás Maduro faced a courtroom, the economy had already testified. No witnesses needed. no confessions required. The evidence was everywhere. An economy that erased 4/5 of its output. A currency reduced to scrap paper. A population that voted with its feet, over 7 million people leaving. A state that could no longer provide food, medicine, or money, the three pillars of legitimacy. This is the final truth of Venezuela. Power didn't fall because it was challenged. It fell because it became economically indefensible. There is a dangerous myth that authoritarian regimes collapse when people rise up. History shows something colder. They collapse when the numbers stop working, when oil revenue can't cover imports, when printing money can't cover wages, when repression can't replace production. Economics is patient. Politics is loud. But in the end, economics always writes the verdict. Venezuela wasn't destroyed by socialism alone. It wasn't destroyed by sanctions alone. It wasn't destroyed by corruption alone. It was destroyed by a sequence. Abundance replaced accountability. Control replaced prices. Lies replaced signals. Printing replaced production. And once that chain is completed, there is no heroic recovery, only damage control. Even today, signs of recovery are deeply misleading. Yes, some stores are stocked, but only for those with dollars. Yes, some neighborhoods look alive, but only because remittances prop them up. Yes, inflation slowed because the economy shrank so much there's almost nothing left to inflate. This isn't healing. It's stabilization at the bottom. A frozen equilibrium where inequality is absolute and opportunity is rationed by proximity to power. And this is where Venezuela stops being unique, because the mechanisms that destroyed it are not exotic. They are universal. Any country that believes it can print its way out of reality. Any government that treats prices as enemies instead of information. Any state that replaces production with redistribution funded by a single commodity is walking the same path. Maybe slower, maybe cleaner, maybe with better branding. But the math does not change. The most chilling lesson of Venezuela is not that it collapsed. It's how predictable the collapse was. Every step was documented. Every warning was issued. Every outcome was explained in advance. And still, it happened. Because systems don't fail when leaders are evil. They fail when incentives are wrong and correcting them becomes politically impossible. In that sense, Maduro was not the architect of Venezuela's destruction. He was the final custodian of a system that had already condemned itself. The economy nailed him long before the law ever could. And that is the verdict. Not just on a man, but on a model of power that mistakes control for strength, spending for wealth, loyalty for productivity. History does not forgive those mistakes. It only waits for them to compound.